Welcome to episode 78 of the Sports Geek podcast. On this week's podcast, I chat with Vince Crivelli about the rebrand of Melbourne United and give my thoughts on giving back to the sports business community.
Welcome to the Sports Geek podcast, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals.
And now, here's your host, who once wore an inflatable sumo wrestling suit under his guise of halftime entertainment, Sean Callanan.
Thank you very much, DJ Joel. And yes, the things that we do for fan entertainment. I did wear a sumo suit at a Melbourne Tigers NBL game back in the 90s to entertain the fans. It was a lot of fun, but I tell you what, those suits are just a little bit sweaty. My name is Sean Callanan, and welcome back. You are listening to the Sports Geek podcast on whatever platform you choose. It can be on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Audio Boom, or even you could be listening to this at Sports Geek HQ, where you can find all episodes. My name is Sean Callanan. You can send me a tweet when you are listening at Sean Callanan or at Sports Geek. Love to hear your feedback during the episode, immediately after the episode, just to know what you're thinking and what your thoughts are on the podcast. And if you are so inclined, and if you're enjoying this podcast or any of the previous 77 episodes, I would love an iTunes review. We recently got up to 48 iTunes reviews on the iTunes store globally. Thanks to Dan, Fiona, Luke, Dewey, who recently left a review. You can simply go to sportsgeekhq.com/iTunes to leave a review. And as always, as I sort of said in the listener feedback episode, at any point you can send me an email, sean@sportsgeekhq.com, if you want to talk about podcasting, sports digital, or if there's any way that I can help you have success in the digital sports world. This week I caught up with Vince Crivelli, GM of Melbourne United, a local NBL National Basketball League team here in Melbourne. It's a short interview. We caught him pre-game, prior to a game, and everyone knows if you are working in sports, how manic it is prior to a game. So thanks very much for Vince to taking the time. And after that, I'll have a chat about my views on the Melbourne United rebrand. Here we are. In the bowels of Margaret Court Arena, waiting for a Melbourne United game. I'm joined by General Manager of Melbourne United, Vince Crivelli. Welcome to the Sports Geek podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Thank you very much. Like, it literally is pre-game. The guys are out there doing the warm-up. I just want to get a little bit of history for people who are listening to the podcast. Melbourne United play in the National Basketball Association, the National League here in Australia. You want to take us through a little bit of your background. When did you join Melbourne?
So in my current role, I started with Melbourne. They were under the brand of Melbourne Tigers, and it was, I think September in 2012.
Yep.
So I've been with the club a few seasons, and prior to that I had a little experience sitting on the end of a bench as an assistant coach in the early mid 2000s.
Yep, and so, you touched on it. This has been the first season under the Melbourne United brand, and, the rebrand. And, full disclosure, the people who listen to this podcast, they can go. Luckily, YouTube wasn't around, because if there was, back in the early 90s, you would have seen visions of me dancing in the stands following Gaze and Copeland and the like. So what you went through a rebrand. You want to take us through some of the whys behind that and how it's gone so far, like nearing the end of the first season?
It's a long story, Sean, and not very much like all sport. There is a little bit of emotion involved in some of that discussion, but in summary, I guess the short answer to your question is, from a commercial sense, we really needed to break away from the Melbourne Tigers brand. There are two main reasons. One, there was duplicity in the marketplace over the brand, but not single governance structure in place.
Yep.
That opened up all sorts of commercial and IP risk that we really couldn't afford to take. The emotional side of it, of course, is that nobody ever bought the brand of Melbourne Tigers to change it to Melbourne United.
Yep.
But more important than the brand is the brand of basketball. And we felt Melbourne needs a team that can survive It's had 13 NBL clubs come and go, all very well publicly documented. And every single time a brand leaves under those circumstances, your corporate support, your member support, everyone is disenfranchised. And we just can't afford for that to happen in Melbourne again. The National Basketball League can't afford for it to happen. And we are taking every possible step we can to turn that around.
Yeah, and I mean, you pointed out there the 13 franchises, so it's not new to the Melbourne market. We've seen teams come and go, and if you look back in what was the heyday when there was four teams in Melbourne running around, and then that was whittled down over time with mergers and things like that. So it's not uncommon in the basketball landscape in Melbourne, but it's always been a powerhouse from athletes and from basketballers coming from Melbourne. So there is a vibrant basketballing community that are out there playing. What are some of the things you've looked to do as part of the rebrand? United is the name to try to unite Melbourne. What have you tried? What are some of the things you've done from a program's point of view to reach out to the basketball community?
Good question. And like any brand, it is just that the people and the actions of the brand are what really determine, I guess, the success of it. So to that end, there's 250,000 Victorian families that participate in the sport of basketball. It's a good number. It's a great number. It's the number one participated sport across a calendar year, which is really important. The other codes call it soccer, AFL, or football as soccer is now known. But AFL, football, they're seasonal codes. Participation in our sport, just by nature of the governance structure at association level, requires it to be on an annual basis. And therefore, basketball is a very relevant sport, but it's also very convoluted because the top of the sport being the NBL or Basketball Australia, and in its time has always had trouble with the product as a consumer product. And so the pathway for young athletes is somewhat convoluted. There's a lot of third-party providers within the industry. And so as a fan or as a participant in the game, it can sometimes be a little bit daunting. It's quite a heavy calendar. There's a lot of people giving you lots of mixed messages. So some of the things that we've tried to do with our influence and being the only Melbourne team in the NBL is we've taken on a major sponsorship of Basketball Victoria, who are the governing body of participation in Victoria, something to the tune of $250,000 a year. Part of that money goes towards the actual development of coaches. Some of the biggest challenges that the community in basketball face is finding coaches that have got some credentials as opposed to just mum or dad who are willing to give up some time and go coach.
I don't know if my level 1 coaching is still valid. I did it many, many years ago, but I don't know if it's still valid. I probably would have to update it if I went back in the coaching ranks.
I suggest you do. But so part of it is to go and get some messaging into the community and some support in some of the growing regions around volunteer recruitment, the education of your coaches and the risk management side of running an association. And we're doing that through providing some funds to Basketball Victoria that go towards those programs, which include hiring an individual to go out and just work with association development. So I think that's the first step that we've tried to do. Some of the other brand messaging that we've gone in with Melbourne United is around respectfully recognising the history of some of the failed franchises. And so at every game we have a past club that we honour. We have a little presentation that we do, probably happening sometime in the next 20 minutes, on the screens, and throughout the week through social media and websites we try to tell the story. There's a lot of great people that have been involved in basketball, to put it simply. Those people are now successful in business. Their stories in sport aren't told.
Yep.
We think they need to be told for the sport to actually go forward. The journey of, for the journey of somebody to belong to a sports club, the history of that sport, or those, they're really, really important. And so no hero can exist if there's no villain. And so for, a city that had 4 teams, as you quite rightly said, 15,000 people, a very healthy economy coming to all those games, a lot of disenfranchised fans because their heroes are no longer there. So telling those stories again is also something that we think is really, really important, in giving those people a platform to become role models back to that participation franchise. There's some of the things that we're doing. We've got our schools program. We've got clinics going on.
I know we saw Melbourne Melbourne legend Warwick Giddy out there doing some clinics before the game. One of the other things is you've gone and done a rebrand, but then not only have you got that in front of you, you're tackling 3 stadiums this year. Challenging year. So you have been playing at the Cage, at the hockey centre out near the zoo, more games at Hisense, and now this arena, which is a perfect venue for basketball, Margaret Court Arena, opened up a couple of weeks before the Aussie Open was on, and you would have seen if you're watching the Aussie Open. I know we've got to wrap this up, but how has it been getting all of those, getting the fans to all these venues, and how have they received Margaret Court Arena?
The fans have been pretty good. It's a monumental challenge operationally, though, to run 3 venues. It's almost like running 3 seasons.
Yep.
Everything's different. The ticketing agencies are different. Back end systems are different. Very difficult to get any kind of synergy from your back office functions from one venue to the other. And little things are often what get missed. Signage, the size of signage. But the biggest challenge by far was just maintaining healthy crowds. So just before the New Year's break, before the Australian Open here at Melbourne Olympic Park, we're around the 7,000 mark, which in a venue holds 10,000. It's a good result and it's a great atmosphere. And, of course, your next 2 home games are now 3,000-seat stadiums. And so you go from a bit of momentum that you've built all the way back down to 3,000 seats. And then tonight here we are again in a 7,500-seat venue, and I think we're on track for about 6,000 here tonight. And
so going forward, what will be the ideal way going forward? How many stadiums, from next year and onwards?
The ambition is to play as many of our fixtured games at Hisense Arena. The reason we choose Hisense Arena is simply because it offers a whole lot more variety in terms of our ability to look after our corporate partners, and the seating is around that 11,000 mark. Margaret Court is our secondary venue. Unfortunately, because of the Australian Open, until we get our own venue, we're always going to have a third venue. So I can't see these problems disappearing. Mark Boyd, our operations manager, just has to keep working hard.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, for the people who have been watching the Australian Open, it happens right middle of the season. So for those 14, 15 days, you guys either have to be on the road or have games at other venues. Correct. So with a couple more games to go, just a final wrap up, how do you think has this season gone, and where do you see Melbourne United in the future?
Well, you look on the court. It's certainly been an inconsistent season. We had high hopes for this group, as any sports club does. I think going into a season, you really think you've ticked all the boxes, and then you realise it's a pursuit of human excellence, and therefore is unfortunately prone to error. So we've broken down a few times, and we continue to play well and then drop a game that we shouldn't drop. And with 5 games to go, we've got to win all 5 and hope that Adelaide drop a game to make the playoffs. It's possible, but looking back 2 weeks ago, destiny was certainly in our hands. If we'd have won that game against Adelaide, we're up, I think, a 4-game split and certainly seeing the playoffs, which in terms of our goal in season 1, making the playoffs, that's deemed a success. So that part still has to play out. Off the court, I've been really happy with how we've been able to sell the message of Melbourne United. The crowds have consistently grown. Membership base is consistently growing, but the corporate support we've had has been phenomenal. And the feedback that we're getting from our sponsors and hospitality partners at our games has been sensational. So I think we're on track to continue to build on that in the off-season, as well as build the brand of Melbourne United. There's a lot of people still don't know what it is. So we've still got a lot of work to do.
The story's just started.
The story and the journey of this club has really just started, and we need to understand how to tell that better.
Well, thank you very much. For those who don't know, Vince's phone has been buzzing for the last 5 minutes, so he's probably got to go back and make sure that the balls are correctly inflated. We don't want to have a New England Patriots kind of Deflategate happening. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and good luck for tonight and the rest of the season.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Sign up for the Sports Geek News at sportsgeekhq.com/SGN.
Thanks again to Vince Crivelli from Melbourne United for joining me in what you would all know is a really busy time prior to the game. I did get there quite early trying to get a little bit of a longer chat, and we pretty much had that chat like 20 minutes before the tip-off of the game. Unfortunately, the boys could not get the win that night, and it really puts their chances for making the playoffs in serious jeopardy. But as we all know, you can't plan for winning. You can only plan for the opportunities that your fans are going to embrace. So it's just the start of a really long journey for the guys at Melbourne United. Just a bit of background from my point of view. As I sort of said there in the chat with Vince, I was a big Melbourne Tigers supporter back in the 90s, in the heyday of the NBL. In the 90s, the NBL was a real force to be reckoned with. It was having sold out games at Rod Laver Arena, where the tennis is played, with 15,000 people turning up. And through a few missteps, it stumbled, and which resulted in some of those teams folding and declining popularity. Multiple factors in the fact that the AFL really took hold of their marketing budget and targeted it at families, and really made that an option for families. So that's where a lot of the entertainment dollar went, myself included. Eventually stopped going to Melbourne Tigers games as I put my sporting and entertainment dollar into other efforts. So it was very disappointing to see the name Melbourne Tigers and the history along with it and then go by the wayside. Very disappointed when the announcement came, but in speaking with Vince and working with the guys at United over the last couple of months, it really is a bigger play, and being able to embrace the people who play basketball and put a new brand out there has really worked quite well. I'll share some images of Margaret Court Arena for the game, a 7,000 seat stadium that was pretty close to full on a balmy Saturday night in Melbourne. So they are getting support, and the fact that they're doing similar things like Michael Brown was doing with the Asian Cup in engaging the community. But as a former Tigers fan, it is a bit disappointing not to see them running around. But I also now know the feeling of those other teams that went by the wayside over the years. So hopefully this is now a team that all of Melbourne can get behind, and we'll see how it goes. The logistical issues of working with three stadiums is something that they're going to continue to have to work with. But it's all about getting a real entertaining product on the floor, both from a talent point of view, but then also from a fan experience and a whole experience point of view, similar to what I discussed with Dan Magala around the Big Bash. People want a great experience, and the winning is the bonus. Is how can we make the experience memorable? How can we make sure that the kids turning up are talking about the memories that they had at those events? And that's something that the guys at Melbourne United are trying to do. What I want to do is a little bit of a different tack in this podcast. I've had because I had a short chat with Vince, I wanted to share a recent short clip from Gary Vaynerchuk. I've spoken about Gary previously in the podcast. Highly recommend his video series and podcast. You can get it pretty much any form you like. The Ask Gary V show. He shared a podcast or a video, and I'll share the video in the notes, but I've also got the audio here on 1 is greater than 0. I'm going to let Gary talk and then come back with some of my points of view on Gary's take.
It baffles me how many people think that they're bigger than they actually are. I hear people say like, well, how do I get in the New York Times? Or how do I get that meeting with that CEO? And oftentimes I just say 1 is better than 0. The steps it takes to actually get to the biggest places in the world. Before you get a meeting with, Zucks or Cuban or Barry Diller or whoever you're trying to have a meeting with in the business world, well, you've got to have a lot of little meetings to build up your cadence. People are always like, man, you've been on Conan and Ellen and the Today Show and CNN and Fox. Like, how do I get that? And I'm like, well, I also did 1,000 interviews, it feels like, on videos that got 1 or 19 or 137 views.
Like my PR people and all my managers and handlers are really pissed at me because they're like, why are you spending 15 minutes doing these blogs that have 6 readers, every single day, and you're passing on the stuff that we're giving you to be on CNN or New York Times.
I still, even today, am as happy and sometimes even more excited to be on a podcast or a video blog that's only going to reach 100 people, because I'm always about depth versus width.
Do you want to go wide or do you want to go deep? I want to go deeper with my community. I want to give back to people that were fans of me.
And so even today, where I have more leverage than I did 3 or 4 or 5, 6 years ago to get bigger platforms, I still live under the motto of 1 is better than 0. To me, doing these interviews is a process of the work that so many people are impatient and not willing to do. Are you willing to take 10 minutes to get 195 views? I am. I don't know who you think you are. You've not gotten the exposure yet. When you have not made your name just yet, when you're still making the climb, when you're not paying attention because nobody else is, because 217 people are watching the video, I'm grinding when you're sleeping. I did those 87s and 59s and 137s and 813 views day in and day out, day in and day out, day in and day out, and continue to. You might make a video on somebody's video show that has 89 viewers, but one of those 89 viewers may be a producer at CNN or might be the CFO of a big company that you're trying to reach. And so undervaluing just that one view, it needs to be the right view, but it's one view, is a humongous mistake. It's about having the humility. It's about not saying no, even when you've made it. And the 1 is greater than 0 concept is something I'm proud that I continue to execute on.
Thanks to Gary Vaynerchuk there. Highly recommend the Ask Gary V show for some of the snippets here. And if you're following Gary on all these platforms, you'll be getting all of that content. He does a really good job of atomizing his podcast content, is one way of putting it, or his video content, because it does start with his strength, which is he comes from a YouTube background. So subscribe to Gary on YouTube as well as listening to the podcast. But on that, 1 is greater than 0. I really do think there's something applicable in that space, both from my point of view and what I've done and what I try to do as far as networking and meeting people and appearing at conferences. I think it's super important to do both from my business, for Sports Geek, but also from a sports business point of view. So if you're not doing the exact same things in your own career, to further your sports business career, I would highly suggest to be getting out there, listening to, consuming content, engaging people who are creating that content, getting into those networking events. And I've been singing the praises of meetup.com, but check out what meetups are in your part of the town. Keep an eye out for SB Week. Russell is starting to release a swag of cities that are going to be involved in April. And that post from Gary really hit home for me, as this week I've done a couple of speaking gigs, I should say. First of all, with Ohio Sports Admin in the class there. Thanks to Dan Budley for inviting me to come along, and then also at NSF. If you've been following the NSF 15 hashtag, plenty of great content coming from the National Sports Forum. Thanks to Dan Magala and Eric Fernandez for inviting me along to wrap up the Social Media and Digital Day. Doing those kind of things are really important to me. And so if you need me to do an interview, talk to you about what you're doing on your blog, that kind of stuff, please get in touch. Sean at Sports Geek HQ. I completely agree with Gary on the point of I'd prefer getting the depth with my audience. And, you're very vital for me to keep doing this. So please send me an email, ask me a question, because it really does drive what I do in the podcast, which leads me to say some of the really big events obviously coming up for me. Seat London, March 17. There are some tickets available. So if you work in a sports team or you work at a venue and you want to see what Seat is about and you're based in the UK, please give me a call or send me an email, Sean at sportsgeekhq.com. I have got some passes left for some late registrations, and that I am talking less than 20. So please contact me now and I'll organise something with Christine and Kylie at Seat to make sure we can get you there. And then the other one, obviously, is the big one, Seat San Francisco. We had some really good conversations with the steering committee in the last week. So Seat San Francisco, 2015, July. Make sure you're there. Some of the stuff that we are planning is going to be really good. And a special call out to Australia and New Zealand teams. I've got a special Sports Geek offer. If you're a first-time attendee and you're coming all the way from Australia and New Zealand, please get in touch. I'll send you the flyer. Only $325 for a ticket, and I can't tell you enough the amount of value that you will get from the 3 days engaging with what I say is the best networking group in the world of sports. I'm going to finish up this episode. Thank you again for listening. Thanks again to my guest this week from Melbourne United, Vince Crivelli, to taking the time prior to the game. I've been forgetting to put on the sounds of the game at the end of the pod, and so this week I've got a clip from the Asian Cup, and it's not a game involving the Socceroos. I just wanted you to get a feel for what it was like. Thanks to Dave McKay for sending that through. This is a clip from Stadium Australia in Sydney when Iran was playing. Until next week, my name is Sean Callanan from Sports Geek, and you've been listening to the Sports Geek podcast.
Please leave a review on iTunes. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/iTunes. Did you know Sports Geek Podcast has listeners in over 50 countries? Thank you for sharing. Like the Sports Geek Podcast? Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/sportsgeek. Thank you for listening to the Sports Geek Podcast.